see most of what you have Joyce or since not all of it maybe. This will just explain quickly what we have.
Okay, so prisoner 1, prisoner 2, yes means I turned you in, no means I didn't turn him in. And then, so like prisoner 1 that turns prisoner 2 in, and prisoner 2 turns prisoner 1 in, then they both get 5 years each. If prisoner 1 says nothing and prisoner 2 turns prisoner 1 in, then prisoner 1 ends up getting 15 years. And then if neither of them turn them in, then they get 0 years. And the same thing is true for if prisoner 2 says nothing and prisoner 1 turns him in. Does that make more sense? Just easier to see if you visualize it.
Is that understandable?
I love it.
Rules you had your hand?
No, I got confused by the way she'd done yes and no.
Yeah, it's confusing for me. I've done it for years now, but I don't know already. But I hope it's helps. Maybe.
Okay, so what happens in this game, Rose? Now can you
It should be an industrial.
What is the point of this game? Rose?
The point of the game or what's happening?
No, point of this game.
The point of the game is to sort of, it's not marching very well tonight, but the point of it is sort of to, like,
Or Joyce, you can explain if you want.
I mean, you can.
Yeah. What does this show?
It shows that communication is like necessary, and without communication, it's really hard to like predict. Basically, in this case, the prison dilemma, like bringing it all back to what we started with, you have to communicate, you have to have trust in the other partners, otherwise we're all going to reach we're not going to be able to like, come to any conclusions.
Well, it's actually unrealistic, especially in the United States, especially if you have like a capitalist free market economy. If you look at, for instance, Nike or Adidas or something like that, they participate in this unwillingly, and then their prices are they're both somewhat in a lose-lose situation, I think, and that happens for car companies as well. And you know, it's just the law of competition in the capitalist economy.
okay, I do have a question. I thought, the way I originally learned the prisoner's dilemma, I thought that if they both don't turn anyone in, they each get like a very, very small punishment, because if they're both getting 0, why would they, like, yeah, I thought the whole point was if you say, I didn't turn you in, and the other person turns you in, and the person who, turns, prisoner 1 turns prisoner 2 in, prisoner 1 gets 0 years, but prisoner 2 gets 15 years if they don't turn prisoner 1 in. But if they both don't turn each other in, they each get like 1 year. So it's kind of like
8 years. They get more years than if they both had turned each other in or something like that. I thought that
no. Because, okay, so what it's saying right now is if they both don't turn each other in, they get 0 years. But the whole reason that I would want that it would be a yes-no situation is that one gets to go scot-free where the other gets a big punishment. But if there's a situation where they each can go free, like by doing something, I don't understand why they just wouldn't do that. That's why I thought it was if they both said no.
The other person didn't do. So if the other person turns them in, then they're like way worse off than the other person.
Yeah, here I have a picture.
If the other person turned them in, they like, so if they say yes, they're assuming that the other person turned them in, and then they get 5 years instead of 15. But if they say no, then they're risking the fact that the other person said yes, and then they would get 15. It's still like an incentive.
Because if you say no, I could still say that you did it, and then you would be screwed.
No,
so,
if they both confess, they each get 1 year, and then if they both don't confess, then they get 5 years.
Okay, so it should say 1 for each instead of 0 for each.
I don't think that's it doesn't matter as long as it's 1. It doesn't matter whether it is 1 or not. The point is that it's better off, but because they don't communicate, they go back 5 years ago. Because they fear that if I don't do that, I will face 15. So just to avoid the chance of getting 15, they do something which brings them from 0 each or 1 each, whatever you may say, to 5 each.
So, do you have internet on that computer?
I don't know.
It might be useful to just show.
Someone just looked it up.
Someone just looked
I
it
think
up.
Joyce is correct.
Okay, when you guys can, just look up Wikipedia on
prisoner's dilemma. Okay? And what the usual solution will be. The usual solution will be somebody, if each person maximizes, each prisoner maximizes his or her gains, it might be that the overall solution will be optimal for no one. So that's the issue, right? And this is happening because of all the assumptions that you're making. One is, of course, they cannot communicate, and B, there is no loyalty against each other, etc., right? So in the Wikipedia example, it says, each serves 1 year if neither of them betray the other, and then each serves 2 years if both of them betray each other, and then if one betrays but the other does not, then whoever betrays goes free and the other serves 3 years. Okay, so that's
like 1, 2, 3 is like 0, 5, 50.
Just example. Yeah, but you can use 1, 2, 3. You can use 4, 5,
10,
6.
20, 30.
But the idea is that if you were to just maximize your own value just from your own perspective, you do something that would not be optimal for it. Kira, and then let's start with the assumptions that we're going to discuss next year.
Well, I think it's just important, like putting it in context of the climate change. So I think why it's important is that if you have 2 firms and they both communicate and agree to reduce their emissions, then they'd all be better off and the market is still stable. But if one says, oh, if I keep producing at the same amount of emissions, the other person reduces, then they'll make better profits. There's always that incentive. But then if they both say yes and they both reduce emissions, it doesn't have an effect on the profit. So I think that's that makes more sense to everyone about why it's important.
Right, and here also the reason why this game came up in this discussion is also in a climate change context, except this is not individual firms but individual nations making these choices. Go ahead, Raj.
What I wanted to point out is that, you see, this whole thing depends upon lack of communication and lack of trust between them. So what we have now is that we have communication, but we do not have trust.
Guys, no individual discussions. Save them for later.
So that is why, while we do have communications, we avoid being actually running off to that 5-5 situation. But we also do not actually get back to 0-0 because we do not have trust on each other. As I said, that it is not guaranteed that if a certain country X takes up certain positions regarding emission control and other things, the other country or the other partner or the other nations in the region will also take up that sort of activities. So that is the crux of what Professor Ganguly wanted to make, that why, in spite of all these things, we are not having such a situation.
Just to add to, I think one of the main points about game theory is showing that even if you act in your self-interest and even if it is rational for yourself, it can lead to a worse outcome no matter what, when people don't have that trust, as you were saying.
How many of you have heard of the Nash equilibrium or seen the movie A Beautiful Mind? So you might want to think about these in that context, right? So as you were saying, individual self-interest, if you do not have visibility to everybody's interest and if you cannot communicate with them, and if you don't trust them, then this issue of individual interest versus the interest of the collective, which may actually be in your interest as well. You might miss that. Those are the things that you try to study.
There is an excellent book called Environment and Statecraft. I don't know if you have heard of that. I forget the author, but if you can Google it for Environment and Statecraft, the first 2 chapters will talk of both the Kyoto Protocol and the Munich Agreement, and then talk of how game theory actually explains why one succeeded and the other failed. Those first 2 chapters with lots of games thrown in would be an excellent reading. Environment and Statecraft.
And remember, the war games is also a game in that same sense. We're trying to understand this game to be able to understand how the negotiation process works. Yes.
But I also don't think that the climate negotiations are necessarily a game theory situation. I don't think that the United States, by making a decision that's bad for the environment, necessarily. I don't think that it's necessarily that there is one outcome that's best for everyone in the terms of the context that decision makers make decisions like now.
No, I don't understand. So you are saying you don't think. So is that a belief or is that is that an informed opinion? Or I mean, this is in what context is it?
I guess just based on what I've learned about climate negotiations so far, I don't think that it lines up with the prisoner dilemma theory exactly, and I don't know.
You have to elaborate on that, not now maybe, but later, in an informed way, right? So why and what are the issues?
I'm just not totally convinced, personally.
No, but about what? I mean, I can understand you're not convinced about what and why. So it's, I mean, you should have your own opinions, but how are they supported by facts or not? That's what I'm interested in. We can talk about that later, but first Pedro and then Rose.
I kind of agree with Nancy because when we were initially talking about this prisoner game, in the context of climate change and emissions, for example, I can see why it would never work, because if you have developed nations that are more, in a way, guilty for the emissions that they've already emitted before, and now they can stop because they have the money and resources to move to renewable energy, I can see why one prisoner, this is not exactly, this doesn't represent that situation, because one prisoner in a way is more guilty than others that are barely starting, that haven't gone through that phase of developing yet, if you know what I mean.
So remember guys, one thing, the prisoner's dilemma is an oversimplified game, which will probably not work in any real world situation. But the question is, does it explain at least some fundamental attribute? I'm not saying it does, but that's the question. So we talked about random, seasonal, chaotic stuff in the context of climate signals. No one of them will explain all of what goes on in climate. It's a collection of all of those and some more, right? So there is always that, and it's absolutely true that this kind of simplified game will not explain the whole process. Question is, does it still explain something, and can you build on that? That's the kind of thing.
Yeah, I kind of disagree with what they're saying and agree with what you're saying, that I think it can represent a very, very simplified version of the negotiations. If you say, for instance, like the US and India looking at sort of a cap on emissions, I mean, the US, if they're being selfish, says, no, like, let India take it all. Like, I don't want a cap on my emissions. And so the US sort of gets to do whatever they want, but India now bears this overburden. But instead, if they both say, if they don't put it on the other one saying they have to bear the whole entire thing, they each get a smaller, it's a more even split. So yeah, maybe for the US, they're saying it's not, the greatest thing to have, a small cap on our emissions. And, for India, they're also saying, well, ultimately we would like to not have that cap either, but it's also, if they both sort of put it on each other, then it gets sort of like, neither one of them are, I guess I don't really see like how, like yes situation works in the climate change negotiations, but I see the other three.
So it may be that the whole thing breaks down or something works, or you need more enhanced versions, right? But how to go from one to the other. William?
Kind of going off of what Rose was saying, but also kind of agreeing with Pedro. I think it applies, but in a different way. Like if you say like prisoner one is like the US in this talks, it's like having a celebrity who broke the rules. They're like in court, they have more sway, they have more power and stuff. And then India is just kind of like your common day citizen, and like more people back like the celebrity in that case. And just kind of like that. It's hard to apply in my mind, I think, just because the US has so much more global power than like a country that's developing.
Right, so one interesting thing would be to start thinking about, could you design a game which would start to model what may actually happen? I mean, these war games that you're doing is an attempt, but it's a different kind of attempt. It's not a game as in game theoretic game. It's a game as in, you put real people, try to make them assume those roles and then see what happens, right? But can you design a game as in game, in a game theoretic way, which builds on the simple kind of games that we know of, whether it's zero sum or prisoner's dilemma, but which begins to model what actually happens in the COPS process. That would be an interesting thing. And of course, ultimately it would not look anything as simple as this, right? That is definitely there, and I agree with our thing there. Yes, Thurston.
I was going to say, I think it's useful as an abstraction from the actual case, because we know that in reality it's much more complicated and there's many more prisoners and things like that. But I would also say, yes, as individuals have different powers, you have to change up how you're going to model it with, say, the different punishments that people have, because maybe, we might both lose, but we don't lose evenly. Whereas in this game, it's each player gets 5 years together, each player gets 0. It might be different. In reality, it's probably different consequences. That's not even. But I think the other thing that keeps coming back to my mind is how there was that one individual on that game show who forced the other player. He forced the other player to choose the option that was better, to choose one of the options that was beneficial to himself. But then that gave him, solely him, the choice to either take all of the money or split it with the other player. And so he decided, on his own morality to split it with the other player. But the point is, since he forced that other player, that's how he avoided getting to the lose-lose situation. He forced the other player to choose the situation where he risked losing. And I think that's, for me at least, that's sort of an inspiration to how to try to look at solving this problem. If you force other countries to choose, you make it so that you promise them or, find another way to say, this is actually your only option, to choose this option which may or may not be beneficial to you. And that gets very controversial and it's very difficult, but otherwise we'll just permanently be at a stalemate where we know it's a lose-lose situation.
So that's a very interesting idea. I'll come to you, Jake, in a minute, but that's a very interesting thought. Remember, there are issues there. So in the context of that game, you are relying on the morality of the individual, right? Here you are relying on the moral compass of a nation or a firm. Here I was mentioning about firms competing. Now, if you are representing a firm, is your ultimate responsibility to make the world a better place, or is it this fiduciary responsibility to stakeholders? I don't have an answer to that. Similarly, if you're thinking about the moral compass of an entire nation, is your job as, let's say, the policymaker or leader of, let's say, the US or of India, to maximize the value add to the US or to India, or is it to make the world a better place? It's not an easy answer, right, for that particular policymaker at that point in time. 10 years later, that answer may become easy. But as of that point, but that's an interesting thought, though. That's, yes, there. So we have to think about ways to break through that stalemate, and that's an interesting thought. Jake?
Oh, yeah, going off what Will said, I don't think this is a really accurate representation, but when he said, like, the US has essentially celebrity status, they got that status, I think, by their, like, prior emissions to the environment. And so I think, like, in this situation, they basically got more status through more guilt. So it's like if one prisoner robbed a bank and then, like, uses the robbery money to, like, pay off the officer.
So this has been a very interesting discussion. It's good points by all of you guys. And again, I'm not trying to, so I don't think, as I've said earlier to you guys, I don't think my job is to tell you what to think, but to try and learn from each other how to think, and how to have informed opinions, and how to start using concepts that we know, whether they're mathematical concepts, abstractions, and how they might relate to reality, how to extend those to reality, etc. So in that context, I think this was a very interesting discussion. Thank you, guys.
No, I think Nick has.
Oh, Nick has. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I think it's like, it's like this, the prisoner's dilemma, but doubly complicated because there are like two variables. It's not just like, so the prisoners are just trading off years, but like if it's the US and India, they're not only trading off like the world emission levels and like the risks that climate change presents, but also like economic welfare. So like one of the biggest problem when it comes to the prisoner's dilemma is that the prisoners aren't able to communicate with each other. But since it's like a doubly complicated model, the two countries have to be able to communicate on like an economic and like an emissions level. So like the point that you arrive at, like the equilibrium, really depends on like if you trust that the United States would help India if they both like limited. So it really like the equilibrium definitely depends on like on which levels you're communicating.
So, Rajesh, as I hear bright students like this, I go back to this discussion that you and I had last time, which is if all these policymakers were just replaced by the students, the world would be a much better place very soon.
Because one reason is because they don't have to sell their ideas to anyone. Like they don't have to get votes. Once that enters into equation of the two largest democracies, where people have to, the policymakers have to sell their ideas, then it becomes altogether a different proposal. But what I wanted to make the point about is that the whole thing about climate change negotiations and policy is about trust and communication. And where communication is existent, the trust is not always there. Especially the trust among, as I said, the electorate of one country and the other, and which makes it difficult for the policymakers, even when they are mutually agreeable for certain policies, to sell their ideas to the electorate. And that's where the problem starts. But now to get back and run through this quickly is that what are the needs for these COPs at Paris and the next Kyoto Protocol? Scientifically, this is somewhat the average one, that a modest target of stabilizing at 550 ppm CO2 equivalent by 2050, which would require something about a 50% cut in absolute emissions. In turn, that would need about 80% cut in per capita emissions. Of course, it should have a steeper target for the non-agricultural sectors, because in the agricultural sector the emissions are already lower than the average. And of course, near zero emission in power and transport. These would be the needs for the next 5 years. If not, then what happens? Like say, if we want to have the 2 degree centigrade pathway, then this is where we want to be by 2030. But if business as usual continues, then the pollutions and the emissions would be going up in this fashion with each of the countries over there. One big thing is aviation, which is of course not taken into account by any of the countries, which is sort of single block. We have 27 EU countries, we have United States, we have India, we have other countries of the world, and we have China. So this is if the business as usual continues. Now what India has been talking of is the per capita terms, that we have to stabilize per capita emission standards at an average level. Then too, we do not have something like converging to the 2 degree centigrade. And mind it, it is 2015 now, so we are midway from where the yellow line starts from. Now this is what would have brought us back to the 2 degree centigrade path. But what does that require? It is not workable, because that would require the per capita emissions to come to a level which is really not workable and sustainable. Because starting from here, we just can't have per capita emissions in the developed countries come down to a level which is about 1/4 of what it is currently. So what is option 1? Option 1 is to sort of stabilize at the 1990 levels, which would also bring per capita emissions closer to each other. And of course here technology will have to have a big role to play, because emission intensity of GDP has to come down, which I think one of the points of the eco-modernist manifesto which we have gone through, that we have to break the link between development and emission by bringing in more environment friendly development rather than stopping the so-called development pathway. So bringing down the global average intensity, energy emission intensity of GDP from about 0.5 to about 1/10 of its level in about 30 years from now, which is also a big task and where technology has to play a big role. One can also think of some out-of-box solutions like, you see, what we have been talking about, the role of dialogue and why it is not a zero-sum game. Breaking the link between growth and emissions and technology devolution. What India is talking of is binding emission targets, again clear but differentiated. Physical renewable energy targets, allow domestic capacities to grow in India. The issue of technology transfer and who is going to finance that, whether that would be of patented technology and whether the patents have to be paid off by the developed countries or whether the norms of patents for climate change mitigation are to be relaxed. To have actually verified emission cuts from the clean development mechanism projects. To have community participation, as I said, breaking the uniformity of development and to bring in more community participation in finding local solutions so that development can continue without being too much reliant on the old Western model of development where it is much more energy intensive and emission intensive. So these are the things that needed to be done or needs to be done at this point of time. What are the possible steps? The possible steps have been talked of right to equal stock, that each country should have a right to equal stock in the over its carbon bank, growth with technology transfer, overseas development assistance to finance a large part of this technology transfer, a physical cap on emissions, but again the other way around is stopping cap and trade because that moves dirty industries to the developing countries and moves the economic benefit to the developed countries. So these are the issues that have been pondering over the last 3-4 years during all these COPs, and that is why one of the major reason of not finding any agreement for the second thing. Now what is the climate change policy in India at present? The main contours of the climate change policy of India is that it talks of protecting the poor and vulnerable sections of society, achieve national growth objectives. It also talks of efficient and cost-effective strategies for end-use demand-side management, that is the demand for energy and demand for other products. Deploy technology for adaptation and mitigation. Devise market, regulatory and voluntary tools for reaching these objectives. And the thrust on again per capita emissions and the severe ethics. So what is being done for that? The tools are through linkages with civil society, local government institutions and public-private partnership. That is what the National Climate Policy of India talks of. It also talks of international cooperation for R&D, sharing and transfer of technologies enabled by additional funding, and a global IPR regime that facilitates technology transfer to developing countries. These are all quotes excerpts from the India's National Climate Policy. So 8 national missions have been declared so far for combating climate change. National Solar Mission for enhanced energy efficiency, that on sustainable habitat, the Water Mission, Mission for sustaining the Himalayan ecosystem, Mission for a Green India, Sustainable Agriculture, and Mission on Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change. But the point is,
might want to note these carefully for whichever team you are representing.
But the point is, these missions have been talked of in sort of silos where there is no overlap and exchange of ideas between these 8 missions. For example, if you think of National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture and National Water Mission, they should be intricately linked, but they have been separated out. So these are issues that are plaguing us. Some recent actions over the last 1 or couple of years is that there is something like an aerosols program which talks of studying the aerosols in a more scientific manner and what it does to the local climate and the global climate and how to do something about that. Some ecological observatories are to be set up all throughout the country. In fact, 80 of them have been planned, of which only 2 have started work. The northeast region has been brought in focus because of the diverse ecological and environmental situation. some climate change assessment institutes will be taken up, and a network of both researchers, institutions, and government bodies will be in place. There is something like renewable energy procurement obligation that all electricity and energy suppliers will have to purchase a certain proportion, which is at present 3% of their total electricity or energy from renewable sources. And there is something called the Prime Minister's Executive Committee on Climate Change, which is to oversee all the 5 others. So I don't think you are able to read this, but these are some of the 24-point program that has been taken up only this year for climate change. You will have a copy of this, so you can go through it later. Now coming to the intended national contributions that India has to submit by October to 2050. What are the issues that India actually is working on? India's INDC report will probably center around these issues, like quantifiable information on reference point. These are the INDC requirements, like time frames and periods for implementation of India's domestic policy, the scope and coverage, that is the gases and the sectors that it is going to cover, the planning process to oversee the fulfillment of INDCs, the assumptions, methodological approaches, including those for estimating and accounting for GHGs, and how the country considers that its INDC is fair and ambitious in light of its national circumstances, and how it contributes towards achieving the objective. Given this framework, what India is talking of is about 1,000 billion units of electricity from renewable energy sources by 2030, which would require something like 39,000 billion Indian rupee investment necessary in the renewable energy sector. But once this amount of electricity comes from the renewable energy sector, and given that cost of renewable energy production and transmission to the grid is much more costly than what is being done now, the average electricity prices will go out of bounds for about the bottom 20% of the population. So that would become unaffordable for them. So electricity subsidies will have to be in place, or subsidizing the technology and production will have to be in place. India also talks of industrialization to sustain growth and turning India into a global manufacturing hub. You know of the so-called Make India campaign, which has been here for about last 3-4 months. The present government wants India to become a manufacturing hub and leverage some of the decreasing productivities and increasing labor costs in China to its own favor, to bring some of the manufacturing activities to India. So India is probably going to submit 2 INDCs in 2 parts. One, what India can do at present given its own finances, and what India can do if international finances and technology are made available to them. This is, I think, what the Environment Ministry is going to go for. This is something which I read this part of the lecture. The whole need of the hour is something like this. This
is very interesting. Is this graphic yours?
Yes.
It's a nice book.
Short captures.
I think we take a short break and
Yes,
then we come
we
back
have
to
tea and coffee here. So we take a short